Although Britain was at war, there was very little sign of it. In the fields and lanes of Kent, Surrey, and Sussex during those early days of August 1940, life carried on with a quietness that bordered on denial. Farmers worked their land, children played in the summer heat, the hedgerows were thick and green, and the English Channel glittered under a cloudless sky. It was the kind of peace that makes what comes next all the more terrible. Because on the morning of Thursday, August the 8th, a decisive new phase began in what would come to be known as the Battle of Britain. And the world those farmers and those children knew, that peaceful world of lanes and hedgerows and shimmering water, was about to be torn apart from the sky. During the previous weeks, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had been concentrating its efforts on British shipping in the English Channel, with scattered sorties against the south and east coasts. But from the 8th of August, the attacks took on a new and terrifying intensity. During the previous night, a convoy of slow-moving merchant ships, escorted by Royal Navy destroyers, had started through the Channel. The Germans detected them, and early the next morning, waves of Stuka dive bombers, flanked by fighter escorts, fell upon the convoy. 7 squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires scrambled to meet them. They brought down 31 German planes for the loss of 19 of our own. 7 merchant ships were sunk. Many more were damaged. This was to be the pattern of attack in the Channel during the days that followed. Meanwhile, in Berlin, plans for the invasion of Britain were being pursued with cold efficiency. Hitler had hoped that with the fall of France, an isolated Britain might be glad to make a peace pact with him. When Churchill bluntly declined the offer, Hitler decided to invade at the earliest opportunity. The plan was methodical and merciless. Phase 1, knock out the Royal Air Force, thereby gaining control of the air and sea lanes across the Channel. Then carry out blitzkrieg tactics, destroy all lines of communication and transport, and above all, get and retain complete command of the air. Phase 2, the destruction of the coastline defenses, followed by massive detachments of parachute troops dropped by the Luftwaffe to seize airfields and establish beachheads. Phase 3, the actual invasion. Panzer divisions would cross in high-speed barges under a protective umbrella of Luftwaffe fighters. Then spearheads of landed troops would thrust deep into England to divide, surround, and destroy all opposition. On paper, it looked unstoppable. In practice, it all depended on one thing: command of the air. And certainly, there seemed to be very little opposition to overcome. In the whole of Britain, there was not enough equipment left for a single modern division. Just 1 tank for every 1,000 square miles of territory. Just 1 machine gun for each mile of beach. The British Navy existed, of course, but it was scattered all over the globe, guarding vital food and supply routes. In any case, it would have been suicide to use the fleet in the narrow waters of the Channel with German forces flying overhead. There was the Royal Air Force, but it was outnumbered by the enemy 10 to 1, both in trained men and machines. And then there were the British people themselves. How would they react in the event of invasion? From the fall of France onwards, they had no doubt that an attempt would come, and that it might come at any moment. They knew that every man, woman, and child in the country would be a target. And so they set about preparing, not with hysteria, but with a grim, stubborn resolve. For the civilian population, the home front defense was the name of the game, to be ready for the onslaught whenever Hitler decided to unleash it. Back in Berlin, that was precisely what Hitler and his generals were discussing. The final touches were being put to the plans for Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's strategy for the invasion of Britain. The time had come for Phase 1 to begin. Göring sent in hundreds of aircraft of all types, bombers, fighters, dive bombers across that 21-mile stretch of Channel, a mere 8 minutes away. The first tactics were to bomb the convoys carrying food and munitions from overseas, bound for the ports of Bristol, Southampton, and London. German planes had already been carrying out scattered raids during July, but this was the first full, concentrated attack, August the 8th. The next phase of the Battle of Britain had begun in earnest. Göring had promised the Luftwaffe it would face little opposition from the RAF and would be able to knock it quickly out of the sky. However, there was a problem, and it was a problem that would prove fatal to German plans. The Royal Air Force of August 1940 was quite a different creature from the poorly equipped outfit Hitler had known it to be at the time of Munich 2 years before. In those 2 years, British aircraft production had surged. New fighters faster, more maneuverable, more deadly, had rolled off assembly lines that had been working around the clock, and the men who flew them had been trained to a standard that the Luftwaffe was about to discover the hard way. The days of August 1940 were absolutely critical for both Britain and Germany, and, if not in fact, for the future of the free world. The skies over southern England became a daily battleground of fighter aircraft. It was a time of war, perhaps the last, when battles were waged on an almost personal basis by scarcely a handful of men, rather than by armies of nameless troops. Those few kept the vastly superior Nazi forces at bay and gave Britain the breathing space it so desperately needed to bring its defenses up to scratch. Meanwhile, the German bombers continued pounding the coast from the Thames through Kent and Sussex to Weymouth and beyond. In just the first 10 days of this phase, the Germans launched no fewer than 26 major attacks. During that time, their aircraft losses totaled 4 times as many as ours, and as many as 60 of the British pilots who bailed out were successfully rescued by the Air Sea Rescue Service, trained and experienced men, fortunately able to fight again. Unlike the German pilots, we fished from the water. The Germans now turned their attention increasingly to port towns, Southampton, Plymouth, and others, trying to immobilize the ports before the supplies from overseas could grow from a trickle to a flood. Though the ports took a terrible onslaught, they could not be knocked out, and vital cargoes continued to be unloaded with the protection of the RAF above. It seemed that attacking the Hurricanes and Spitfires in the air simply was not working, so Göring decided to smash them on the ground at airfields such as Hawking, Manston, Tangmere, and Biggin Hill, names that were to become household words to the citizens of Britain. Many planes were saved by being parked in airfield corners close to trees and hedges, instead of leaving them exposed on runways while awaiting the next sortie. The cost to the German attackers was high, and many trained pilots finished their war as prisoners. It was a frustrating time for the Nazi leaders. On a 2,000-mile front from Norway to Normandy, the Blitz program was being stymied because the RAF was still flying. Hitler sent for Field Marshal Göring and ordered him to bring British resistance to a quick end. It was seriously holding up his plans for invasion before mid-September and the end of summer. So Göring ordered all-out attacks not only on airfields further inland, but on factories, machine shops, and anything supplying the aircraft industry. If he could not knock out the RAF in the air, he hoped to knock it out by starvation on the assembly line. He adopted the tactics of using proportionally more fighters per bomber, so that the bombers were well protected for doing their job. Escorted by fighters all around them, they were able to break through coastal defenses by sheer weight of numbers and reach further inland than they had so far managed bombing aerodromes, aircraft plants, munitions, factories, and machine shops. And yet the people's morale held at a remarkable level. Their defense system was improving rapidly. Observation and listening posts were set up all along the coast. In addition to radar, all of this contributed to detecting enemy approach activity before the Germans had even left the continent. A quick flash from a control station to the nearest fighter station, and British pilots were on their way to greet the enemy before he reached the shores of Britain, intercepting while still over the Channel. Day after day, aerial battles were fought in the skies 4 or 5 miles above the countryside of Kent and Sussex, sometimes out of sight and often out of sound of the spotters below. The pilots kept flying, barely snatching a couple of hours' rest before scrambling to another sortie. This sometimes continued for days on end. These were young men, most of them barely out of their 20s, and they were carrying the weight of a nation's survival on their shoulders. Each time they climbed into the cockpit, they knew the mathematics were against them, and yet they climbed in anyway. As far as the Nazi leaders were concerned, their plans for invasion were going nowhere fast. On a 2,000-mile front from Norway to Normandy, the Blitz program was being stymied by a force that should, by every rational calculation, have already been destroyed. Already, Hitler had been forced to postpone the proposed date of Operation Sea Lion, his plan for the invasion and occupation of Britain. The RAF should not still have been flying, but it was. And that single, stubborn fact was unraveling everything. The time had come to employ a different tactic. From now on, the objective was plain and simple: to crush and devastate the spirit and morale of the people, to make it impossible for them to continue the war against the Nazis any longer. It began on the afternoon of Saturday, September the 7th. The siren sound that Londoners had heard in daylight from time to time during August was now to become part of the daily and nightly life of every child, woman, and man in the capital. For more than 100 consecutive nights, It came along with the drone of enemy bombers, anti-aircraft fire, and the whistle and crunch of high-explosive bombs, dropped in their thousands. For the Luftwaffe, there was no pretense of striking only military targets, and to their surprise and the surprise of neutral nations, sometimes even to the surprise of Londoners themselves, the people steeled themselves to it. Throughout the following week, Goering sent fleet after fleet of bombers to smash the spirit of the citizens, but without success. Goering now decided to throw in the full might of his Luftwaffe in one of the greatest air attacks ever mounted. It was a Sunday. The date, September the 15th, 1940, a day that would become one of the most famous in the Battle of Britain. It was an ideal summer day when his fleet of 500 bombers and fighters flew over the Channel and crossed the English coast. Londoners taking a Sunday stroll were unaware that an historic three-dimensional battle was being fought to the death in the skies above them throughout the day, across a front 60 miles long, 40 miles wide, and 5 to 6 miles in height. In the first half hour alone, 200 individual combats had taken place. The sheer scale of it was staggering, hundreds of aircraft wheeling, diving, firing, and falling across a volume of sky that stretched from the Channel coast to the heart of the capital. Some German planes pierced the London defenses, some reached the sky above the city center, but everywhere they turned, the fighters of the RAF were there to meet them. It was not until most people had returned home that evening and listened to their wireless sets that they learned about the most decisive air battle of the war. The first reports gave an overestimate of the German aircraft shot down. It was not until much later that the figure was revised downwards. Nevertheless, it was a mortal blow to the Luftwaffe and to Hitler's plans for invading Britain. On the 17th of September, just 2 days later, the invasion was postponed indefinitely. But the bombing did not stop. The Nazi military policy now shifted to the destruction of the capital, mostly at night. The RAF could not be much help after dark. It all rested on the efficiency of searchlights and the accuracy of anti-aircraft fire. The German bombers concentrated particularly on London's docklands and left the East End a roaring inferno. But some things gave the people hope. British bombers were taking the Blitz back into its country of origin. Hitler, furious, proclaimed the RAF night gangsters, and for their crime, he vowed to exact on British cities a 1,000-fold revenge. The first target of that revenge was the city of Coventry. On the night of the 14th of November, 1 million pounds of bombs were hurled on the city. Between dusk that night and the following dawn, Coventry was bombed flatter and more heavily than Rotterdam or Warsaw. Its ancient cathedral was reduced to a skeleton of stone. Its factories were gutted. Its streets were unrecognizable. And yet, the almost total destruction of Coventry and other cities such as Plymouth brought the war not a second nearer to its end for the Germans. If anything, it hardened the resolve of a population that had already decided it would not be broken. For 109 consecutive nights, one part of London or another was savagely bombed. The people endured it with a stoicism that astonished the world. They sheltered in underground stations, in basements, in Anderson shelters dug into back gardens. They emerged each morning into streets that looked nothing like the streets they had known the night before, and they went to work. But unexpectedly, one night, the citizens had their first night off, December the 25th, 1940, Christmas Day. It was an unbelievable break, but only a break. The bombing began again soon after. In the days that followed, however, the citizens became aware that the raids were becoming shorter and fewer, so that by the spring they were hardly there at all. Then, almost out of the blue, the Blitz returned with doubled fury. For many people, it seemed worse than anything that had gone before, as millions of firebombs rained down on the capital. In a matter of minutes, more than 1,500 sections of the city burst into roaring flames, flames that merged together into the greatest fire since the Great Fire of London, almost 300 years before. Below ground, in the tube stations and shelters, the people of London felt they were back where they had been 4 months ago. It seemed they would have to endure it all over again. But the next day, to everyone's amazement, there was no siren. They did not know it then, but Hitler had turned away from Britain to undertake the conquest of Russia. The Battle of Britain had been finally won, but not by Hitler. He had lost 2,375 planes and crew. For the first time, the Germans had tasted defeat. For almost a year, they had struck Britain with their formidable might. They had killed over 40,000 British people and seriously wounded 50,000 more. But from the start, not one single Nazi soldier set foot as an invader upon the soil of mainland Britain. The Battle of Britain and the people who won it, also won for the world a year of precious time in which to prepare for final victory. On the 20th of May, 1942, Allied listening stations around the Pacific picked up a lengthy radio signal in code from Admiral Yamamoto to his fleet. American intelligence cracked it, and what it revealed was staggering. The Japanese Navy was about to mount a powerful attack on the mid-Pacific atoll of Midway, with a secondary diversionary attack on the Aleutians further north. Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians would be hit on the 3rd of June, and Midway the day after. Yamamoto had committed almost the entire Japanese fleet to his plan 160 warships, including 8 aircraft carriers with more than 400 carrier-based aircraft. Admiral Nimitz, the American Pacific Fleet commander, knew the odds were stacked heavily against him, but he staked everything on his faith in the aircraft carrier and its ability to strike from long range. Nimitz divided his force into 2 battle groups, Task Force 16, with the carriers Hornet and Enterprise, and Task Force 17, with the carrier Yorktown. Warned by intelligence, they were in position well before the Japanese submarines had established a cordon west of Hawaii to watch for the American fleet. The Midway garrison had been reinforced, and during the previous night, flying fortresses had landed at Midway. By 0700 hours, they were on the runway being refueled. Once the enemy was sighted, they would be in place and ready. On dawn patrol, Ensign Jack Reed, flying a Catalina flying boat from Midway, was scouring the horizon for signs of the enemy fleet. At 0900 hours, he spotted the transport ships and escort cruisers of the Japanese invasion force. He ordered an attack to be mounted by the Midway-based B-17 flying fortresses. As the bombers lumbered down the airstrip, news came into Admiral Fletcher that the Japanese diversionary attack was already underway in the early hours of the morning. The Japanese had attacked the Aleutian Islands. Torpedo bombers and Zero fighters from the carrier Ryujo attacked the United States base at Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, inflicting damage on the oil dumps, barracks, hospital, and a church. But Nimitz was not deceived. He refused to divert large forces north, away from Midway. The 4th of June, the United States fleet's main prey, the Japanese carrier striking force under Admiral Nagumo, was zigzagging through dense fog, completely oblivious to Fletcher's fleet lying in wait. In the early hours of the morning, they reached calm and clear conditions. At 0430 hours, Nagumo launched his first strike. 108 aircraft took off from the carriers to attack Midway. They were immediately spotted on Midway's radar. The Zero fighters appeared from behind the clouds, and the island's defenses went into action. Midway's fighters went up to engage the enemy. Considerable damage was inflicted on the airfield, buildings, and garrison, but the airstrip remained intact, and that changed everything. Nagumo was now in a quandary. His first attack had not knocked out the airfield as planned. It was still operational. A second air attack was needed, but before he could make a decision, the Americans made up his mind for him. The bombers from Midway arrived overhead and attacked his ships. Although they did no damage to the fleet, they did change the course of the battle. The Japanese commander ordered his second-wave torpedo bombers to be rearmed with bombs for another attack on Midway. At 0728 hours, just 15 minutes after the commander had ordered his aircraft below one of Nagumo's search planes, spotted 10 United States warships, some 335 kilometers northeast of the Japanese carriers. Ironically, this plane had taken off 30 minutes late that morning. Had it launched on time, it would have spotted the American fleet 30 minutes earlier and got the news back before the torpedo bombers had been sent below for rearming. If that had been the case, Nagumo would almost certainly have sent his aircraft against the United States fleet, and the course of the battle and of the entire war in the Pacific might have been very different. As it was, Nagumo faced yet another quandary. Should he turn his attention to the American ships or concentrate on Midway? And unbeknown to Nagumo, Fletcher had already launched his aircraft and was about to attack at any moment. Fletcher had ordered the Hornet and Enterprise ahead to strike while the Yorktown waited to retrieve its spotter planes. At 0700 hours, the Hornet and Enterprise, still a long way from the Japanese carriers, launched 152 aircraft. They were aware the Japanese were landing planes after the attack on Midway. They were taking a big gamble, launching from such a dangerous long range. But what these pilots did not know was that Nagumo had changed course when he decided to reload his aircraft. As a result, the first waves had difficulty locating their prey. At 09:28 hours, the first American torpedo planes from the Hornet appeared over the Japanese fleet, diving into attack. The Japanese launched their Zeros, attempting to drive the bombers away, and there was a fierce and bloody fight in the skies. By 09:45, another wave of torpedo bombers arrived from the Enterprise, followed by another wave from the Yorktown at 10:15. The American losses were appalling. The Zeros and anti-aircraft fire from the ships were taking their toll. Only 4 out of the Enterprise's first wave made it back to the carrier. The Hornet and Yorktown crews suffered equally. Those that did make it back faced the harrowing task of landing a battle-damaged aircraft on a rolling carrier deck. But what the torpedo bombers had done without knowing it was draw the Japanese Zeros down to sea level. Every last fighter had descended to deal with the low-flying attackers, and that left the sky above wide open. The sacrifice of those torpedo bomber crews, men who flew into a wall of fire knowing they had almost no chance of survival, had unwittingly created the opening that would decide the battle. It is one of the most heartbreaking and consequential moments in the history of naval warfare. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey scanned the sparkling blue Pacific Northeast of Midway Island. He was leading 33 dive bombers from the Enterprise, and he was lost. Where he had expected to find the enemy, there was nothing. His planes would soon have to turn back for lack of fuel. But McCluskey had a hunch. He decided to continue his search a little further west, and that gamble paid off. Nimitz would later describe this as the most important decision of the entire battle. A few minutes later, McCluskey spotted the wake of an enemy destroyer and followed it. Just after 10 to 100 hours, he found the Japanese carriers. The first waves of torpedo bombers that had attacked previously had suffered disastrously. Most had been shot down by the Zeros. But that sacrifice had pulled the Japanese fighter screen down low, and it let McCluskey's dive bombers come in completely unnoticed. Joined by a further 17 dive bombers from the Yorktown, McCluskey could not have arrived at a better moment. The decks of the Japanese carriers were crammed with nearly 100 aircraft, fueled and armed, as they prepared for their own strike against the American carriers. And as those Japanese carriers turned into the wind to launch, 50 United States dive bombers came hurtling in from the sky. The first hits turned the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu into exploding torches. Within minutes, most of the Japanese First Air Fleet had been wiped out. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, survived and tried a desperate counterattack. At 1200 hours, she launched her aircraft against the Yorktown. Despite desperate maneuvering, the Yorktown took several direct hits. She fought hard for survival, but it was in vain. By 1440 hours, following another direct hit from a torpedo, the Yorktown was so badly crippled that Fletcher had no alternative but to abandon ship. He handed command to Admiral Spruance, commander of Task Force 16. At 1700 hours, Spruance launched his aircraft from the Hornet and Enterprise. Their mission, attack the Hiryu. 4 direct hits set her decks ablaze. The Hiryu was crippled beyond repair. During the night of the 4th of June, while the American crews prepared their aircraft for the next day's battle, the Japanese carriers Soryu and Kaga sank to the bottom of the ocean. As dawn broke on the 5th, news came back that the Hiryu, still burning like a torch, was sinking fast. Shortly afterward, reports confirmed the remaining carrier, Akagi, had followed the same fate. 4 of Japan's finest carriers had gone. On the 6th of June, Yamamoto gave the order for a general withdrawal, but not before American planes attacked 2 Japanese cruisers, sinking one and badly damaging the other. On the morning of the 7th, damage control crews boarded the Yorktown in an effort to save her, but she was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine and sent to the bottom. While both sides had claimed the earlier Battle of the Coral Sea as a victory, there could be no doubt about Midway. The United States had destroyed the Japanese main striking force, 4 carriers and a heavy cruiser, 322 aircraft, and almost 5,000 men and officers. The American Pacific Fleet, far from being destroyed as Yamamoto had promised, had won a remarkable victory, and as so often happens in military history, they had won it against an enemy far superior in terms of numbers. While the Japanese effort was compromised by poor strategy, tactical error, and misfortune, the Americans were aided by excellent intelligence, naval air organization, tactical command, And most important of all, a great deal of luck. Despite the loss of one carrier, 137 aircraft, and 307 men, the Americans had turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. No longer would Japan be in a position to risk a major fleet versus fleet action. From this point forward, they were on the defensive. In September 1939, Bomber Command had only 53 squadrons. Of these, only 33 were considered fully operational, and 10 of those were immediately dispatched to France to accompany the British Expeditionary Force. The squadron's aircraft were Blenheims, Hamptons, Wellingtons, Whitleys, and Fairey Battles, all of them at least 6 years old in concept. With little more than 30 first-line bombers based in Britain, Bomber Command was clearly incapable of pursuing any true bombing offensive against Germany. Throughout the winter months of 1939 to 40, RAF bombers were dispatched in tiny formations on what were termed armed reconnaissance sorties, maintaining the tight formations advocated by the bomber hierarchy. The young crews were quickly disillusioned about their defensive capabilities. The disastrous results revealed the inadequacy of the unescorted bomber theory and forced the RAF to restrict its bombing to night raids. On the 16th and 17th of December, 1940, in possibly their last significant raid of that year, RAF Bomber Command marked a new departure. The aiming point for the 134 aircraft was not any industrial area or individual building, but the very center of the town of Mannheim. This was a reprisal raid in retaliation for the bombing of Coventry and other British towns. It was the largest number of British bombers to date sent to a single target, and it was the first purely urban attack. The first 14 Wellingtons were sent in with incendiary bombs to set the town alight and mark the target, whilst the rest of the bomber force followed the glare of the flames. At a cost of only 3 aircraft lost and 4 more which crashed on return, the force destroyed 476 buildings, killed 47 people, and made a further 12,166 homeless. 1941 opened with a raid on the very first day of the year. More than 100 aircraft took off to bomb the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory and other industrial targets in the city of Bremen. The raid was a success, and losses to the RAF were slight. Oil was the primary target that year, but poor weather hampered operations through the winter. In March, another diversion arose, which took bombing away from those oil targets for 4 months. The priority shifted to defeating Germany's attempt to cut off Britain's food supplies and her connection with the United States. By mid-March, 17 new squadrons had been added to the force, and even more importantly, the first of the new heavy bombers were trickling into service. By early 1941, the high-capacity bomb had made its debut on March the 31st. 2 4,000-pound bombs were dropped on Emden by specially modified Wellingtons. These new weapons were complemented by an increasing variety of incendiary bombs, often with explosive charges that scattered burning content over a wide area. The Admiralty, absorbed in its campaign against the German submarines threatening Britain's lifelines of merchant shipping, pleaded strongly for bomber squadrons to continue to be employed against the U-boat bases, and especially the German capital ships Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen, based at Brest. Apart from one last big raid on Gelsenkirchen on the 14th and 15th of March, attacks on German oil dwindled away. In the next 3 months, 28 attacks with an average strength of around 100 aircraft were aimed at one or other of the 3 main ports, Hamburg, Kiel, and Bremen. Hamburg was among the least difficult targets to find in Germany, and the damage inflicted was therefore considerable. The raids caused over 500 fires, made some 3,700 people homeless, and twice the Blohm und Voss U-boat yards were hit with considerable accuracy. But the raid on Bremen on the 27th and 28th of June revealed a disturbing new development in the enemy's defenses. German night fighters were now operating in large numbers. The result was the highest number of bombers lost in a night raid so far, 14 aircraft out of a force of 108. For the young men who crewed these bombers, each sortie was a journey into the unknown. They flew through darkness, through searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, knowing that the odds of completing a full tour of operations were stacked against them. And yet, like the fighter pilots over Kent the summer before, they kept going. By July, the air staff was free to return to a strategic bombing campaign. It was clear that the earlier campaign against oil installations had caused little damage and no major effect on production. In a directive issued on the 9th of July 1941, Bomber Command was ordered to dislocate the German transportation system. This would have the effect of isolating the Ruhr, the industrial heartland, and preventing any movement of war materials to the front. If the weather over Western Germany as a whole was poor, then the more distant targets of Frankfurt, Mannheim, and Stuttgart should be bombed. In November 1941, 105 Squadron received its first example of the revolutionary de Havilland Mosquito, the all-wood bomber that was the harbinger of a host of Mosquito variants, destined to become a major factor in the strategic bombing offensive against Germany. But the truly momentous turning point for Bomber Command came on February the 20th, 1942, when a new commander took up his appointment, Air Marshal Arthur Harris. Only 6 days previously, a directive from the Air Staff, sanctioned by the War Cabinet, had ordered Bomber Command to commence a prolonged aerial bombing campaign, in which large targets, industrial towns, and cities were to become primary targets for night bombing. On the 8th and 9th of March, and for the following 2 nights, bombers guided by the new G navigational aid hit the town of Essen. G proved itself an excellent navigational tool, though they found it was not precise enough for blind bombing of targets. On the 13th and 14th of March, after a raid on Kiel, Harris turned to Cologne. 135 aircraft managed to start 237 fires, destroy several factories, and damage over 1,500 houses. Essen remained the #1 target, and over the next 2 weeks, Harris made 5 more attempts to hit it. Then came the night that changed everything for Bomber Command. On the night of the 30th and 31st of May, 1942, a total of 1,046 bombers took off in 2 waves from airfields throughout the east of England, destined for Cologne. They were preceded by 88 aircraft on intruder and diversionary sorties to confuse the German defenses. Never before had the German night fighters been offered such a golden opportunity, but no fighters came. Hitler, against the advice of his commanders, had made another of his costly mistakes. He had forbidden the Luftwaffe to attack the RAF over British soil. Had he not given this order, the first 1,000-bomber raid could also have been the last, and possibly the costliest raid ever for Bomber Command. At 23:14 hours, the first bombers were spotted on German radar. As the stream passed over the Dutch coast, there was surprisingly little resistance from the night fighters, although considerable flak. At 45 minutes past midnight, the first of the stream approached the target. They converged on the center of the city. They came in and bombed at a rate of 1 aircraft every 6 seconds. Incendiaries crashed downward, splashing brilliant white as they hit the ground, then turning red as the timber caught fire. House after house, building after building began to burn. The huge rubber works was hit, and then the railway station. For the bombers still coming in, the red glare was like daylight. The people of Cologne were now finding bitter meaning in Propaganda Minister Goebbels' words. "We're all in the front line now." 90 minutes later, it was all over. 13,000 homes had been destroyed. 45,000 people were homeless. 1,500 factories were obliterated beyond repair, and 630 more were seriously damaged. Harris had achieved his prime objectives and received approval for future massive expansion of the force. This marked a true turning point for Bomber Command. In August 1942, a new formation of huge significance came into being, the Pathfinder Force, whose purpose was to spearhead bombing sorties and locate and mark targets accurately before the main bomber stream arrived. Another significant moment came in December, when Mosquitoes used OBO, the revolutionary new navigational aid, for the first time on an operation. It was December the 20th when they set out to bomb the coal plant at Lutterade in eastern Holland. Bomber Command now had a long-awaited blind bombing system. As 1942 drew to a close, Harris had a force that was much stronger. Cologne had proved that accuracy in hitting targets had increased by 30%. The final proof of OBO's success was confirmed on the first night of 1943, when 2 OBO-fitted Mosquitoes, bombing from 28,000 feet through thick cloud, hit the German night fighter headquarters near Florennes in Belgium. Lancasters led by Pathfinders found and attacked with some success Dusseldorf, Duisburg, and Essen. A total of 43 major raids were mounted between March and June 1943. The last blows on the Ruhr came on the 25th and 26th of July, when Harris sent 705 aircraft to bomb Essen, and on the 30th and 31st of July, when a force of 273 aircraft hit the town of Remscheid, a Ruhr town not previously attacked. 4/5 of the built-up area was destroyed, and over 100 factories and commercial buildings were put out of action. On the night of the 16th and 17th of May, 1943, 19 specially modified Lancasters of the recently formed 617 Squadron attacked the Möhne, Eder, and Sorp dams using precise attack methods and specially constructed explosive canisters. They shattered the dams at Möhne and Eder and damaged the Sorp. It was an operation of extraordinary daring and precision, and it remains one of the most celebrated in the history of aerial warfare. By the summer of 1943, Bomber Command had been joined in its offensive by the B-17S and B-24S of the United States 8th Air Force, whose concentration on daylight sorties initially forced them to suffer a high casualty rate. These heavy daylight raids complemented Harris's nightly onslaught. This combined bomber offensive was authorized by a fresh directive from the Combined Chiefs of Staff, codenamed Point Blank, dated June 10, 1943. Expressing concern over the mounting casualties caused by the enlarging and increasingly efficient Luftwaffe fighter defenses, Point Blank called for a switch in concentration to targets directly related to these fighters and their supporting industry. Hamburg was next. As the second most important city of Germany, it offered great possibilities as a target for area destruction. In 1943, Hamburg was the largest port in Europe and Germany's second largest city, with a population of around 1 million. On the night of July the 24th and 25th, 791 bombers took off on their grim task of destruction. 80 miles from the German coast, pathfinders put down yellow route markers for the first time. The crews dropped bundles of metallized paper strips codenamed Window, designed to paralyze the German radar. All but 63 of the 791 aircraft dropped 2,277 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs into the built-up areas of the city and port. But the bombing was only the beginning. The fires that started with the incendiary devices whipped up into a blazing inferno. Hamburg became the world's first city to experience a firestorm. The weather had been very hot and dry, which caused the timber to burn easily. The fire spread and soon became one immense bonfire. The rising heat was so intense, it created a violent upcurrent, which sucked in fresh air at ground level, reaching gale force, even hurricane force speed. On the night of the 27th and 28th, Bomber Command struck again. Nearly 800 bombers attacked, and 729 of them released a further 2,417 tons of bombs. The massive firestorm continued an inferno of such ferocity that it created its own weather system, its own winds, its own terrible logic. 2 further raids completed the fearful destruction of the ancient city. The Battle of Hamburg was one of the most concentrated and successful series of operations undertaken by Bomber Command. In terms of destruction, the results were unprecedented, but in terms of human suffering, they were almost beyond comprehension. Hamburg forced both sides and the world to confront what strategic bombing truly meant when taken to its logical extreme. Harris's next objective was Berlin, the big city, as it was termed by the bomber crews. Beginning on November the 18th and 19th, 1943, a total of 16 major raids were sent against the German capital. These raids devastated over 2,000 acres of Berlin, killed nearly 6,000 inhabitants, and rendered 1.5 million Germans homeless. The cost to Bomber Command was not light. 492 bombers and their crews were missing. The point-blank plan, which had begun in early 1943, culminated in late February 1944, when for 6 days and nights, starting on February the 23rd, Bomber Command and the United States 8th Air Force combined in what became known as Big Week, dropping 16,506 tons of bombs on Germany. It was a concentrated fury of destruction aimed squarely at the Luftwaffe's capacity to defend the Reich. The skies above Germany had become the most dangerous airspace on Earth, and both sides knew that whoever controlled them would control the outcome of the war. In preparation for Operation Overlord, a new directive came for Bomber Command, the transportation plan. Knowing how dependent the German armies were on the railways, this was a plan for a major assault on the rail transport systems, which it was hoped would create a railway void between Western Germany and the French coast. The task was split between Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force. In all, from the opening assault until the final D-Day blow on the 2nd and 3rd of June, Bomber Command put in 69 such attacks. The damage was enormous from Cologne and Aachen through Ghent and Courtrai to the centers around Paris, and as far afield as Le Mans and Orléans. The railways became scenes of desolation. By late August 1944, with the Allied armies flooding across Europe toward Germany, the Chief of the Air Staff requested that Bomber Command be released from Eisenhower's direct control to recommence the purely strategic bombing offensive. Priority targets were now defined as Germany's oil refineries and remaining war industries. The German transportation system and tank and truck production plants were given second priority. The German war machine was being brought to a standstill. In the autumn of 1944, Bomber Command also continued with its highly productive mine-laying operations, and its maritime operations went far beyond this, attacking U-boat pens and hitting the coastal towns of Königsberg, Stettin, Bremen, Emden, Kiel, and Wilhelmshaven. By early 1945, German oil and fuel production had already diminished to a relative trickle, starving the aircraft, tanks, and transports still desperately fighting on all fronts. Harris continued to adhere to his personal creed of area bombing. And then, a new military situation emerged. The successful Russian offensive, which had begun in mid-January, was driving deep into German territory. As the Russians advanced through Silesia, it became apparent that air attacks on the East German cities which confronted them might powerfully assist the Soviet drive. At the Allied conference at Yalta, the Russians requested Allied cooperation in mass bombing of all communications in Germany to prevent any reinforcement of the Eastern Front. Following a few days of bad weather, on the 13th of February, Bomber Command was ready for the assault on an unsuspecting German city. After a 10-hour flight, the first wave of bombers approached Dresden. The city below was ill-prepared for its fate. The resulting fires could be seen from 80 kilometers away. It was a scene of total devastation. The city had gone. In its place was a pile of rubble and burning buildings. Rescue workers fought to free trapped survivors from the shelters below. The firefighting crews could not cope with the overwhelming number of burning buildings. This once proud and beautiful city was now thick with flames and smoke. Many people had died in the shelters, crushed under the weight of fallen masonry. Many more were trapped, but the rescue workers could not reach them in time, and hundreds perished from asphyxiation. More people died in Dresden than in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. From the very first hours of the war until the final flights above a totally ruined Nazi Germany, the men of Bomber Command never flinched from their given tasks, returning night after night into the deadly skies over Europe.